Good afternoon and welcome to the National Association of Counties membership call or webinar on our analysis of the bill that we talked about yesterday, the State, Local, Tribal, and Territorial Fiscal Recovery Act, introduced by Senators Padilla and Cornyn, a bipartisan bill that passed the U.S. Senate by unanimous consent, meaning all 100 U.S. senators agreed to pass this bill. It's now going to the U.S. House where we need some action, and that's what we're going to update you on based on yesterday's feedback. Also, Erin Hurley is joining me, who I think most of you know has been working with U.S. Treasury since the get-go, and she's going to provide some really important updates on some of the reporting that's required, and also just review some of the FAQs, some key provisions that we keep getting asked questions about, so we wanted to go back through and highlight. So I'm going to kick us off real quick and just start again on this bill S3011, the State, Local, Tribal, and Territorial Fiscal Recovery, Infrastructure, and Disaster Relief Flexibility Act. Quite a tongue twister, but this bill is really important. While it may not be perfect, it really does capture a lot of the main priorities that we have been trying to push based on county leader feedback. Again, Senator Padilla from California, a Democrat, and Senator Cornyn, a Republican from Texas, came together along with 6 other U.S. Senate co-sponsors, and they spearhead really the swift passage of this bill S3011. As I mentioned earlier, it was passed with unanimous bipartisan support on October 19th, and it is headed to the U.S. House for consideration. What we want to stress to you is a lot of your U.S. House members may not be aware of this bill yet because it passed the Senate so quickly. And again, in this climate, it's pretty rare for the Senate to have unanimous consent with all 100 senators agreeing to pass it. It did happen on October 19th. And so we need your assistance to raise awareness with your House members that we want to pass S3011 now, whether it passes moving together with other infrastructure legislation or separate, whatever the best vehicle is what we prefer. We got a lot of questions yesterday that the way the bill is written is fairly complicated, but we are trying to hold on a second here. How about that? Let's see. Now we got the slides up, so hopefully you're seeing our slides now. So as I just mentioned, again, the bill, there it is S3011, and it was introduced by Padilla and Cornyn. What we try to do is take the bill and put it into a little bit more streamlined format so folks could understand. We had a lot of questions yesterday about what was eligible and what is not. So for America's counties, there's 3 main impacts, really 2 that we'll focus on. Number 1, is it says the $65.1 billion that was already authorized by Congress and that counties are receiving through the American Rescue Plan, the Treasury ARP dollars could be used under a number of existing federal statutes. For example, under what's known as the FAST Act, which is the Federal Surface Transportation Program, you could use your ARP dollars for eligible uses under the Federal Surface Transportation Program. You would need to follow the U.S. Department of Transportation's rules and regulations for those programs, but you could allocate those ARP dollars. There's also 4 main programs that you could use the ARP dollars as your non-federal match for those U.S. DOT programs, and we'll get to those specifics in a second. You could also use the ARP dollars for the provision of government services. And if you remember, under the existing Treasury interim final rule, there is an allowance under lost revenue for government services and under the main guidelines. And again, I'll get to that in a second on the specifics. You could also use the ARP dollars for what would normally be eligible under the HUD Community Development Block Grant Program or CDBG program. And you could use your ARP dollars for emergency relief to deal with natural disasters, including the negative economic impacts of those natural disasters. So they're really broadening the funnel of what you could use this for. infrastructure, general services, CDBG, and natural disaster recovery and response, including helping those that have negative economic impacts. The second provision deals with those counties that are traditional public lands counties that receive PIL or payment in lieu of taxes money from the Department of Interior. Under the American Rescue Plan, it was fairly loosely defined what was a public lands county. This bill clarifies that, yes, what they are referencing are those counties that normally receive federal payment in lieu of taxes allocations each year would be the counties that receive this additional money. It does take 1% or about 15 million over 2 years of the 1.5 billion for the public lands counties, and it shifts it to US territories since they did not get an allocation under the American Rescue Plan. And then third, for any state, local government, or tribe that does not want to draw down their Treasury ARP dollars, it simply says that that money would be used for federal deficit reduction. Aaron, I think at last count, we were down to just a dozen or so counties that were not planning to draw this down. So really not that many counties would be impacted, but those counties that choose not to apply to Treasury, that money would be left for deficit reduction. When we get into the specifics, what this bill would allow is about $27 billion to be flexed by counties for infrastructure, and about 17 billion would be allowed to be used for government services. So out of 65 billion, about 44 billion would be allowed to be flexed, pretty significant. Let's dig into more of the specifics. So for this bill, again, it's a proposed bill. It is not signed into law. We still need to get it through the US House and to the president's desk. Those two main provisions, the cap on infrastructure flexibility. So what the bill says is, of your county allocation, you can use either up to 10 million, or if you have a larger allocation, say, you're a large urban county, you could use up to 30% of your county's total Treasury ARPA allocation, and you could use it for things that would comply under the Federal Surface Transportation Bill, under CDBG, under Department of Housing and Urban Development, for emergency disaster relief, and for general services, which I'll get to in a second. Previously, the American Rescue Plan had a set aside for water, wastewater, and broadband. That remains unrestricted, meaning if you're doing water, wastewater, or broadband, that does not apply to the 30% allocation or the 10 million. That would be above and beyond what they would allow under these four new uses. One of the small little modifications is if you're going to use the money for this infrastructure flexibility, you still need to have signed contracts by December 31st, 2024, but the work must be performed and the money spent by September 30th, 2026. You might remember under the interim final rule that you have till December 31st, 2026 to complete all the work. So they're basically moving it up a quarter of the year for this particular provision. For the allowance for general services, this is an additional up to 10 million. So you could use the 10 million or the 30% for infrastructure, plus you could use an additional up to 10 million for the general services that are defined under Treasury's guidelines. The definition of general services is very broad. The bill does give some illustrations like the Treasury regulations. It's probably easier to say what it cannot be used for. That's rainy day funds or reserve funds, for legal settlements, for previous pension obligations, and for debt payments. So very broad use. I believe that about would be able to use almost their entire allocation for, or 2,700 counties, I'm sorry, 2,700 counties could use almost their entire allocation for general services. We are still waiting for clarification if the 10 million for general services or government services is above your lost revenue calculation. It seems to be that way, but until we have 100% confirmation, we're still waiting for clarification. And what I mean there is if your county determined your lost revenue amount per year, is this an additional 10 million, or is it within the lost revenue calculation? It seems to be both, but again, we're going to wait for clarification. Real quick here, that when we talk about the Federal Surface Transportation Program and what would be eligible for infrastructure, here is the laundry list. You will see that there's 3 programs highlighted in yellow, plus 1 at the bottom. For the National Significant Freight and Highway Projects, for the TIFIA loan program, including repayment of existing TIFIA loans, and for fixed guideway capital infrastructure grants, you could use your Treasury ARP dollars to meet your non-federal or local match requirements for those programs. Congress is currently debating another federal infrastructure package, and you would also be able to use your Treasury ARP dollars for this new National Infrastructure Project Assistance Program if it's signed into law. So here is the list of existing US DOT programs, primarily in Federal Highway Administration and Federal Transit Administration, that you would be allowed to use your Treasury money for those eligible uses. Things like the culvert removal and replacement might be one that's really important to counties. Obviously, a lot of these are important, but some of the smaller projects, please note that you would have to follow the federal statute for those programs. And there's a lot of questions that we have. You would need to comply with, for example, NEPA, the environmental review. And so we are looking at what are the categorical exclusions and what are some of the specifics around each program. Again, many counties are used to dealing with the Community Development Block Grant Program, the HUD program. You could also use your ARP dollars for those activities, the planning, technical assistance, public works, public facilities, economic development, public services, housing, different programs that are normally allowed under the HUD Community Development Block Grant Program. You could flex your Treasury ARP dollars for these types of activities. Again, you would need to follow HUD's rules and regulations for those uses. And then just lastly, as I mentioned, for those counties that are PILT public lands counties, there are some changes in the legislation. They took 1% of the 1.5 billion that was slated for counties and redirected it for US territories that didn't receive an allocation under the original bill. They cleaned up some language around the areas of the country that don't have fully functioning county governments, particularly in New England, so that the towns would receive that money rather than the state. And they also changed how the boroughs in Alaska would receive the money, similar to, I think, the Secure Rural Schools program and how that money would flow. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions about that, but we wanted to kind of give you an update on that Padilla, Cornyn bill. Again, we want to urge the U.S. House to pass it as soon as possible. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Hurley, who's going to focus on the current Treasury American Rescue Plan allocation to counties and some of the important updates that Treasury has sent us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. So what I will do today is kind of do a recap of some of the most recent announcements that the U.S. Department of Treasury has come out with regarding the ARP interim final rule. So first and foremost, the most recent communication that we received from the Department of Treasury was actually earlier this month. And what they did is they provided an update of where they are in terms of the process for finalizing the interim final rule on the ARP Fiscal Recovery Fund. As many of you know, the deadline to submit comments in response to the interim final rule was back in July. Treasury received over 1,000 public comments in response to that interim final rule. And they did state that they are continuing to comb through those comments, respond to those comments, making sure that the final rule does account for all of those comments and items that were brought up. and submitted to the Department of Treasury, and that they are hopefully releasing the final rule sometime this fall. However, I think the most important, the key takeaway of this slide here that you see on the screen is specifically around that you can begin investing recovery funds right now under the interim final rule. We've heard a lot of concerns from counties saying if we begin investing funds under the interim final rule and the final rule is different, will those funds be recouped? Now with Treasury's communications, they explicitly state that the state saying funds used in a manner consistent during the interim final rule period will not be subject to recoupment. So what that means is that you can go about investing these funds, and whenever the final rule does come out, they are not subject to any sort of recoupment as well. So that is a big update from Treasury around that. And then in terms of new reporting updates from the Department of Treasury, counties, both smaller counties and larger counties, had to submit a interim report or a recovery plan performance report back in August 31st, which outlined how you have either started to obligate or actually spend the dollars. Because that reporting process, difficulties specifically with that process, Treasury ultimately ended up revising the deadline for counties to submit their first project and expenditures report, which was going to require some additional detail in contrast to that interim report that was due back in August. So originally that project and expenditures report was actually due on October 31st of 2021. And now Treasury has extended that deadline back to January 31st of 2022. So again, they provided a couple of additional months to submit that information. They still have not released a template for that project and expenditures report, but we do expect them to release some sort of template, additional information, a user guide within the next month or so. Also, one thing to note as well too, this is in regards to the interim report. If your county did not certify for funds until after July 15th of 2021, you did not have to submit your first interim report on August 31st of 2021. Whenever your county actually receives those funds, you have 60 days to submit that interim report. So again, very key item to note in regards to there. Also, if your county is having any sort of difficulty uploading your interim report, please reach out to us and we will put you in contact with Treasury to receive one-on-one support. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. So for a recap in terms of how you can actually spend the funds before we go on to an overview of some of the most recent FAQ iterations that Treasury has released. But by now, I'm sure you all are very familiar with how you can spend the funds, but just want to note that there are kind of 6 overarching categories when we're talking about areas of investments for the recovery funds. First is to support the public health response as well as address negative economic impacts. Within Treasury's interim final rule, these are probably the 2 most broad categories within the IFR. So if you're able to really just link back whatever project, service, expense back to COVID-19 or the impacts of COVID-19, it will likely be an eligible expense under these 2 categories. We also know, of course, that you can use recovery funds to replace lost revenue and use that those revenue replacement dollars for government services that Matt had just outlined. You can also use the funds to provide premium pay for essential workers performing essential work. So what that is specifically is an additional $13 per hour on top of an individual's regular hourly rate or a cap of $25,000 per person. And again, they must be both an essential worker and performing essential work, which is regular in-person interactions. And then, of course, you can also invest the funds in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Specifically for the water and sewer infrastructure projects, what Treasury did is aligned eligible projects with that of the Environmental Protection Agency's Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund as well, too. So moving on to some of the key highlights, as your county has received the funds, developing those plans and actually implementing them on the ground. We just wanted to pull some key areas of specific interest to counties. First and foremost, we all know why the Recovery Fund was established. It was to help turn the tide of the pandemic, address economic fallout, and lay the foundation for a strong and equitable recovery. When we're talking about when you can actually cover costs with recovery funds, there is a covered period associated with the fund. That begins on March 3rd of 2021 until December 31st of 2024. However, those covered period dates, there are some flexibility around those, which we'll get into more detail in just a minute. But specifically for this slide, I want to highlight that December 31st, 2024 date. That's just simply when you need to obligate funds by. You actually do not need to physically spend those dollars until December 31st of 2026. As Matt mentioned also earlier, in terms of certification, there is no deadline for counties to certify for recovery funds. We have less than 100 counties that have not certified yet, but we are working with them on a daily basis to certify them as well. But again, no deadline to certify for those dollars.
And Aaron, I would just say, well, there's no deadline. There are different proposals in Congress to establish deadlines. So I wouldn't take it for granted that there will not be a deadline at some point.
And another point about, although there is no deadline, if your county does wait to certify for the funds as well, what that simply means is that you will just receive your second tranche at a later date. So you'll be up against a timeline, that deadline, that specifically December 31st, 2024 and 2026 deadline. So it is good to certify sooner rather than later. When we are talking about the recovery fund, we know that there is broad flexibility and ways to invest those dollars. But specifically when we are talking about supporting populations that were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, Treasury refers to these populations within qualified census tracts. So again, there's a much longer, broad range of services, specifically support services that you can provide to communities within qualified census tracts. In terms of interest-bearing accounts, we know that you can distribute recovery funds into those interest-bearing accounts, and whatever interest is earned off of that money, you can actually spend them outside of the traditional eligible expenses outlined in Treasury's interim final rule. And then as you are developing your plans, it's definitely important to note the differences between the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund and the ARP Fiscal Recovery Fund. There are three kind of overarching differences. There are some limitations around using dollars to cover payroll support, specifically for public health and public safety workers. You can also not use the dollars for the non-federal match requirement. And then you also can't use the funds for tax anticipation notes, also known as TANs as well. And then just a few other key highlights is that you can also use recovery funds to rehire local government staff to pre-pandemic levels. So whatever your staff level was prior to January 27th of 2020, when the public health emergency was declared, you can use recovery funds to rehire your staff. You can also use the funds for routine pension costs of employees, and then of course, also to invest in critical infrastructure projects as well. This on this screen here simply won't spend too much time on this just because we already talked a little bit about the reporting requirements, but I do just want to reiterate first is the interim report. Again, if your county did not receive funds until after July 15th of 2021, you just have 60 days to submit that report to Treasury. And then again, that initial project and expenditures report is now due on January 31st of 2020. Instead of the original date of October 31st of 2021. And then when you do submit your first project and expenditures report, in terms of the frequency in which you'll submit follow-up project and expenditures reports is dependent upon the amount of award your county received. So if your county received $5 million in total ARP recovery fund allocation, your reports will be due on a quarterly basis after that January 2022 date. And then if your county received less than 5 million in total funds, your project and expenditures reports are due annually. And then finally, the recovery plan performance report. This only applies to counties that have populations of 250,000 residents and above. These plans are definitely much more so forward thinking. So you will be required, the first one was due August 31st of 2021. Your next one will be due August 31st of 2022. However, you are not bound to these plans per se. Treasury does provide you with the flexibility to make changes, resubmit those plans when your next plan is due, given the fact that they understand that circumstances changes, your residents' needs changes. So again, you are allowed to stray away from an original plan that you may have submitted.
Thanks. I'm going to let Aaron take a quick breath here. We've got about 27 really good questions. As soon as Aaron is done going through the Treasury FAQs, we will get back to a lot of your questions. So just hold tight, and we're going to try and get through as many of those questions as we can. So Aaron, back to the Treasury FAQs.
Perfect. Thank you. So for the next several slides, I'm just going to pull out some of the key bullets that I think folks would be interested in hearing about. So on this slide here, we know now we have written confirmation that recovery funds can be used to cover costs of consultants who help assist in managing and administering the funds. We also know that recovery funds can be used to establish public jobs programs. So that's subsidized employment, combined education and on-the-job training, any sort of service or program to help accelerate rehiring of individuals that may have lost their jobs during the pandemic. You also can use the funds for childcare assistance. If an individual goes back to work, but they need childcare, you can use recovery funds to cover that, as well as transportation assistance.
So Aaron, on that question, we're getting a lot of questions about pandemic pay versus incentives to hire new county employees. So here is pandemic pay can go back to the beginning of the pandemic, and it really has specific criteria for forward-facing or public-facing employees. You couldn't be working from home.
Correct.
And you could provide up to what, $13 an hour?
Yes.
And there's a cap on how much any one individual can get. I think it's $25,000. That is separate where a county is trying to hire new people. Maybe you've lost public health staff, or if you've lost people in your court system, or firefighters, police, et cetera, and the county's scrambling to rehire or hire new people. This is where you would point to in the FAQ if you wanted to provide new hiring bonuses or childcare. This is the part of the FAQ or the rule that they would point to.
Correct. Yes. This is a little bit different than the premium pay or the pandemic pay. So this is where you would receive that clarification about.
Okay.
Then also number 4 on this slide as well here. This one, I'm not going to get into too in the weeds on this one specifically, but this is going back to, as I mentioned before, the covered period. And there is flexibility around the start of the March 3rd, 2021, beginning of the covered period. I had mentioned earlier, you can provide premium pay all the way back to when the public health emergency was declared. So all the way back to January 27th of 2020. You also have flexibility when you're calculating revenue loss, since you have to, your base revenue year is the full fiscal year prior to January 27th of 2020. And then specifically in terms of the public health response and negative economic impacts, say if you had a resident who was 4 months behind in their rent, and that cost was incurred by that specific household prior to March 3rd, but then that expense was not submitted to the county until after March 3rd, you could use recovery funds to do that as well. And then for the water, sewer, and broadband projects, flexibility again with that March 3rd date. Say you started the planning of those water, sewer, broadband projects prior to March 3rd, but again, that expense wasn't passed on to the county until after March 3rd. You could also use funds in that sense as well too. And then finally, number 6 on this slide here is simply just to reiterate that counties do not need approval from Treasury to determine whether an investment in a water, sewer, or broadband project is eligible under the interim final rule. Simply, Treasury states that recipients need to read the interim final rule. If they feel comfortable with how they are spending the funds, they can go about beginning investing them. They do not need coordination with Treasury or EPA.
So this is an area where we're getting questions in the chat where, particularly for water, sewer, and broadband, again, for water and sewer, you look at the Environmental Protection Agency, US EPA's drinking water and clean water state revolving funds. There is a list of eligible uses under those programs, and you can make an automatic assumption that if that activity is traditionally allowed under EPA's clean drinking water or safe drinking water programs, then you can move ahead. What is different here than, say, the Padilla-Cornyn bill that we were talking about earlier is you don't need to follow EPA's rules and regulations for water, sewer, and broadband versus the transportation program. So people are getting a little confused, and rightfully so. And people are looking for EPA or Treasury to bless these water and sewer projects. But as you just said, you as the county simply look and see if it would normally be eligible. And if so, you can move ahead.
Yes, correct.
Kind of a scary thought for county officials, but that's the way it's set up. You want to keep going on the next one? Or?
Yes, next slide,
Okay.
please. So on this slide here, when Treasury updated their FAQs, it was all around broadband investments specifically. Folks joining us today, you may remember when Treasury released their interim final rule, there was a lot of confusion specifically around the thresholds around what an eligible broadband project really was. So as outlined in Treasury's interim final rule, what they said is that these funds should really target to support households and businesses that do not currently deliver 25 megabits download speed and 3 megabits upload speed. And then Treasury also encouraged that recovery funds be used to fund projects that deliver, quote, reliable services, which ultimately had a minimum of 100 megabits download speed and 100 megabits upload speed. So again, there was some concern around that threshold. Simply what this iteration of the FAQs did is that it outlined that there is flexibility around that project threshold. So recipients actually have flexibility to invest in projects that have 100 megabits download speed, but then 20 to 100 megabits upload speed as well too. And then if you are investing in areas, if say a business doesn't necessarily meet that specific threshold where Treasury encourages you to support the household or business that doesn't meet the 25 megabits download, 3 megabits upload speed, you can still invest in that household. You are not limited around that. So again, there's just more flexibility when they release this iteration of the FAQs. And then finally as well too, they did clarify that you are able to use recovery funds towards middle mile projects as well too.
Great.
So on this slide here, mostly what I would like to focus on are the top 3 bullets here. So number 1 is around assistance to households or businesses. When we were reading through the interim final rule, we started speaking about the interim final rule to counties. There were a lot of concerns around, well, what are the reporting requirements associated with demonstrating that a household or business was impacted by the pandemic? Will we need to represent that every single business and household had a negative impact because of COVID-19? That would have created a lot of administrative burden for counties, almost fairly unrealistic to do that at that point. So what Treasury has stated is that you do not need to go by household or business by business. Simply, you just need to be able to demonstrate that there was a negative economic impact at the population or group level, and that satisfies the reporting requirement for Treasury.
So an example there, Aaron, would be restaurant workers in your community.
Mm-hmm.
There's a blanket allowance that restaurants were clearly
Yes.
impacted.
Correct. Yep.
Or convention hotel workers, or so it can either be a group of people below 50,000 income or
Mhm.
a certain threshold,
Correct.
or it could be an industry.
Exactly. Yep. Correct.
Could be
And
neighborhoods, et cetera.
exactly. Yep. And there is more information around specific reporting requirements for this population or group level in Treasury's compliance and reporting requirements guidance as well too. And then moving on to when we're talking about investments in outdoor spaces. So a lot of flexibility from Treasury around this. So specifically, when we're talking about outdoor spaces, any sort of space that would be within the qualified census tract that I had mentioned earlier, that would ultimately support these populations within a QCT, any sort of outdoor space that would ultimately create stronger neighborhoods and communities, within a specific emphasis around addressing health disparities and social determinants of health, the enhancement of outdoor spaces as well too. So that's making renovations to restaurants, or improving the facades on the county's buildings. And then finally, of course, too, is that you can also use the funds for parks and recreation, meaning that what Treasury intended, and they actually state this in their FAQ, they understand that there was additional wear and tear on these parks during the pandemic. They were being used a lot more. So you can use recovery funds for the maintenance of those parks too.
It's also a main COVID mitigation strategy, is to get people outside.
Exactly. Yep.
So,
yep.
Okay.
And then number 3, this is one that NACo actually worked very, very closely with Treasury on to receive clarification. And that is that you can use the funds to expedite court case backlog cleanups. We heard from a lot of counties that because of courthouse closures, there was a huge backlog in processing these cases. So ultimately what Treasury has said that you're able to do now is that you can use recovery funds towards either hiring court staff or attorneys and any other costs that would help assist in expediting that court case backlog. So we were very, very happy to see this clarification in this iteration from Treasury.
And this is the one area where a county can actually hire above its pre-pandemic employment levels. They can actually hire more staff to help clean up the court case backlog above the staffing that they had pre-pandemic.
Yep. And then the final one that I want to touch on is number 6 on the screen and this is simply just because it did make a lot more, many additional eligible uses for recovery funds. So to respond to increased violence and crime during the pandemic. So what happened here, this clarification was released in conjunction with a strategic plan that the administration came out with. But ultimately, if you do have any sort of questions around eligible uses for law enforcement, I would recommend that you go to that part of this FAQ. So specifically, you can rehire law enforcement staff above pre-pandemic levels, and it really kind of frees open a lot of other allowable uses of recovery funds in terms of law enforcement through this FAQ as well. And then the last update that we have received from Treasury on this slide here, specifically what I would like to point out is number 3, which is allowing recipients to pool funds for regional projects. So what that means is that your county can transfer to a neighboring county or work with the state or local partners to invest those recovery funds in projects that would benefit all of your constituents. This is a deviation from the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund that had limitations around this actually. So we were very happy to see this clarification and allowable use within the interim final rule as well too. And then finally, number 7 on this screen is around Davis-Bacon Act requirements or those fair labor wage standards. Simply what Treasury says is that these Davis-Bacon Act requirements do not apply to projects that are funded solely with recovery funds, except for those projects undertaken by the District of Columbia. However, very important to note is that if you are commingling recovery funds with other federal funds and those federal funds are subject to the Davis-Bacon Act requirements, then you would the recovery funds therefore would be also subject. But again, if the project is solely funded by recovery funds, they are not subject to Davis-Bacon Act requirements.
And Aaron, going back to number 1, because I see some questions here in the chat relating to number 1, just to stress again, anytime the county takes its money and allocates it to a nonprofit or another organization, that organization still needs to comply with the Treasury guidance.
Correct.
Just because the county gives it to a nonprofit doesn't make it general funds that they can do whatever they want. The county is ultimately responsible for the use of the funds. by any of its contractors or any of its subgrantees, if you will.
Correct. And so what we're recommending is if you do suballocate to these nonprofit private organizations, is that you should set up some sort of contract with those entities to make sure that they are complying and fulfilling those reporting requirements established under Treasury as well too.
Great. So want to go to the chat? We
Yep.
have a lot of questions here. We're going to do our best to go through them. So when it says rehiring of staff due to COVID, specifically for the court backlogs, is that considered part of revenue loss? That is not part of the revenue loss. That is an eligible use under the broader interim rule. If you are using it, your lost revenue allocation, then the rule doesn't really apply as far as those caps. When you're using lost revenue, you have much more flexibility.
Correct.
So the key when you're investing the dollars is you've got to tie it back to the earlier slide and the categories that Aaron showed here. You basically need to tie it back to one of these buckets that we're showing here.
Exactly.
Okay. And then talk to us about procurement regulations. And is there additional guidance on what federal procurement regulations? It was really you working with GSA on getting some training and clarification for county officials on what procurement rules are required.
Yes. So in terms of the procurement requirements with the recovery fund, just kind of in a nutshell, is that the recovery fund, since it is just like any other federal grant, they are subject to requirements that are set forth by the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal rewards. That's also known as the uniform guidance. So outlined in the uniform guidance, there's a subsection that's all about procurement as well too. So we are working with specifically Treasury, likely OMB, to host a webinar around what those additional uniform requirements really look like. How can you ensure that you are complying with those uniform guidance requirements in addition to Treasury's reporting? But short answer is that you will need to follow the procurement, requirements set forth under the uniform guidance.
Real quick, questions keep popping up to the Padilla-Cornyn bill. So we're going to shift gears from the Treasury guidance, go back to Padilla-Cornyn proposed legislation. Again, you could use the greater of 10 million or 30% of a county's allocation for federal infrastructure eligible uses. Plus, you could use up to 10 million for government services. So if you're a county that had more than $10 million, you could use it for both. If you're a county that has less than $10 million, you could still mix and match because those are ceilings. They're not a floor. So if you're a county that received less than 10 million, you could still use some for infrastructure. You could still use some for government services. There's a lot of questions here about under Treasury's current rules, can a county reimburse itself for administrative costs to manage the Treasury ARP dollars? So you can hire a consultant, but can you capture your own costs if you're going to manage it in-house? Or do we need to clarify that from Treasury?
I would say we need additional clarification from Treasury, but we do know that you can cover all administrative costs with the recovery fund.
Okay. So you can recover administrative costs?
Yes.
Okay. And we'll get at that in writing from Treasury to clarify that it includes the county's own time. So there's a question here. Can ARP funds be used to pay for pay raises for existing county employees? I would caution against that. I would say you could do more one-time pandemic pay.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So I would structure it more as one-time pandemic pay. And you can provide pandemic pay, through the end of the national emergency, or is it through 2024?
Obligate by 2024, spend by 2026.
Okay. So hopefully folks are getting the nuance there. I would not call it a pay raise, but if you want to do pandemic pay for those eligible employees, So all county employees are eligible as part of the first test.
Yep.
But if they're working from home, they're not. But if they're working in their traditional work location, then they would be.
Yes, it's for Treasury defines essential work as regular in-person interactions or physical handling of items between people. And as Matt said, if you are performing work from a residence or teleworking, that would not be considered essential work. So that person would not be eligible for premium pay.
Great. And then for Davis-Bacon prevailing wages, under the current Treasury rules, Davis-Bacon, as you said, does not apply to the water, sewer, and broadband projects. If you're only using Treasury plus other non-federal money.
Correct.
If you're using federal programs that require Davis-Bacon, then you're matching those dollars, or you're mingling those dollars, if you will, then Davis-Bacon applies.
Correct.
So if you're trying to use it for federal highway or something else, then it does.
Yes.
So hopefully people are clear on that. The interest earned on these funds. So counties have millions of dollars sitting in bank accounts. They're accruing interest. What can they use that interest for?
So with that interest, you can use those dollars how you would like to. They are not limited to the eligible uses set forth under Treasury's guidance.
So that's why we're trying to get counties to get this money in their bank account. The interest that you earn, you can use for much broader governmental purposes. Normally, under federal programs, you have to return the interest to Treasury. So this is an exception. Under this program, you can use the interest earned. That's why we're pushing programs like our 3+1 Cash Fest, so you can really maximize the interest payments. We will be getting out an action alert on the Padilla-Cornyn bill with a sample letter so that you can send an email or phone call to your members of Congress. We'll give you a sample letter with those talking points. And so look for those to be on the way. Also, for the Senate Bill 3011, the Padilla-Cornyn bill, just a reminder that it applies to state governments, local governments, tribes, and territories. It's not just for counties. So all those provisions that we went through on the Padilla-Cornyn bill, they would apply to states, local governments, tribes, and territories. Obviously, we're the county, so we were focusing on that. And let's see. Anything else that you want to add?
Nothing too much on my end. Just since the county template letter did get brought up for S 3011, in addition to the county template letter, which we did send out earlier this week to all of NACo's members, we also are standing up a new resource hub. It'll either be finished later today or tomorrow, where we provide a legislative analysis of the bill. We will have that county template letter on there as well too. We also have a table of the new sort of flexible ARP allocations that will be able to be used either towards infrastructure or government services. So again, that webpage will be stood up either later today or tomorrow morning. That will have all the resources and information that you need on this bill.
And then real quick, people are asking about the public lands payments. We don't have the formula yet. Treasury is still developing how it will allocate the public lands money. To just give a comparison, normally the PILT program is around 500 million a year, not exact, but around. The new additional allocation will be around 742 million a year. So people are asking, will the public lands enhancement be the same as their normal PILT payment? We don't know county by county, but nationally, it's about 1.5 times the normal size of the program. So we anticipate it to be a significant bump. I'm going to do one more check. We will be sending out a lot of this. Let's do the last one. A lot of questions in here about construction. I think capital infrastructure improvements is the #1 question we probably still get. Can you use the current Treasury ARP dollars for construction, particularly for jails, for mental health facilities, for hospitals? Why don't you give your quick answer on what people should be really thinking about if they're going to try and do construction?
Yes, so if you are using the funds for construction, what you need to make sure that you are able to do, or what the reason behind the construction is that you are responding to COVID-19 operational needs. That's explicit language from Treasury's interim final rule. So again, if you are expanding a jail, again, to promote social distancing, reduce transmission of COVID-19 within your jail system, yes, because that would be in response to a COVID-19 operational need. So again, you just need to make sure that you can link it back to that. Also, if you are, again, using the funds for construction projects, you need to be very careful in terms of your timeline. Matt and I have mentioned a number of times now that you need to obligate all of the funds by December 31st of 2024 and spend all of the funds by December 31st of 2026. So you just need to make sure that you're completely accounted for. All of those funds are either obligated or spent by both of those dates. Ultimately, Treasury has the authority to audit up to 5 years after the program finishes in 2026. So you just want to make sure that that project is fully complete by both of those dates.
And then two more things on that is, if you're looking to make major capital infrastructure improvements, again, outside of water, sewer, and broadband, we're talking about you want to retrofit your jail, maybe you want to fix your courthouse, you have a 911 center, you have an emergency response center or emergency operations center with an EOC, that whatever investment you make needs to be reasonable and proportional to the activity. So you can't go build a $200 million facility if your current one's maybe 5 million. It's got to be proportional to, it's got to be reasonable.
Yes.
And so that's really important. The other thing is you cannot use the Treasury ARP dollars for debt financing. That includes existing debt. And so we're trying to get clarification if that means new debt, if you tried to build infrastructure. So that's something we're still asking about. A lot of questions here. We really appreciate your time. We're almost to the hour. Anything else that you want to add?
No, I'm all set on my end. If we were unable to get to your questions today, we do have them saved on a file, and we will be putting those in our database that NACo developed, and we will be responding to in the coming days as well.
So one last question was on the operational needs that you just mentioned. Do we have that in writing from Treasury? We do.
Yes.
It's not in the FAQs as much as it's in the reporting.
So it's both in the FAQs
Okay.
as well as the interim final rule too.
Okay. And so we'll follow up and provide that specific language because it's probably the most important question that's getting asked. Thank you again, and we really appreciate it. We will continue to have these updates as Treasury provides more guidance. Lastly, we want to encourage everybody to look at NACo's Untold Stories campaign, where we really need to tell the story of how counties are investing this money, not just the dollars and cents of how you're allocating the money, but how you're impacting people's lives in your communities, whether it's small business owners like restaurants and folks maybe dealing with tourism, to some of the folks who've been really impacted by COVID, either through the public health emergency or actually losing their jobs, and how you are really helping people in your communities. So please be sure to share your stories with NACo so we can share it with the media and members of Congress and the administration. So thank you again. We sincerely appreciate it.